The United States has seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic after pursuing it from the coast of Venezuela. Washington says the tanker is part of a so-called shadow fleet that carries oil from countries such as Venezuela, Russia and Iran in violation of US sanctions. The vessel had stopped an earlier attempt to board it last month near Venezuela, where a US raid on Saturday toppled the country's president, Nicolas Maduro. US special forces snatched Maduro and his wife from Caracas and flew them to New York to face trial on drug charges. Since then, President Donald Trump has said that Venezuela will turn over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States to be sold at market value and with the proceeds controlled by Washington. A former diplomat and international relations expert, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, joins us right now to give us more analysis. Dr. Makhubela, the US has recently carried out a large-scale military operation, as we've come to know, that resulted in that much-publicized capture of the Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, and this has also drawn global attention as well. Let's speak about this. Why does this matter under international law, especially since the UN Charter generally prohibits force against another sovereign state?
Good evening, Nhlanhla. You know, you're quite correct. The only justification for any military intervention in a sovereign state is through international law. And that decision could only be made by the Security Council. In the absence of the Security Council resolution, which is the custodian of international peace and security, any action that is unilaterally taken would deem to be irrational and illegal. You may have seen during the debate at the Security Council that even though some members don't agree with the Maduro government, but they don't condone the means that were used by the United States to take Maduro out. So quite honestly, the jury is out that the United States has acted in an illegal manner.
Yeah. Also interesting is that South Africa has formally condemned the US's action as well, calling it, I quote, a violation of Venezuela's sovereignty and the UN Charter. Is this consistent with South Africa's long-held foreign policy principles, or does it expose contradictions here in how we apply those principles?
Well, South Africa is quite right to really speak about international law and the UN Charter. There's nothing contradictory in that. Sometimes, Nhlanhla, you know, people misunderstand the definition of policy. Policy is what you decide to do or not to do. If you take a policy that you keep quiet on certain issues, it's a decision that you've taken. So South Africa has taken a policy in this case to be very vocal on this matter. Whether this is in the strategic interest of South Africa or not, it's a totally different matter. But in terms of the content of South Africa's argument, that has been supported by many countries around the world, even countries that are very close to the United States. They are of the view that the US action is contrary to international law.
Yeah. So some political parties here in this country also describe US measures, including the capture of Maduro and that recent capture or seizure of the Russian-linked oil tankers as imperialist aggression. That's how they describe it. Is that a useful way to think about today's global order, or is it driven more by a political ideology than legal analysis?
You know, the South African political space is very much divided in this respect. You get parties to the left and the far left, and parties to the right and the far right. Some of these parties are participating within government. So the decision and policy articulation vis-a-vis this matter from different political parties are informed by where they stand in terms of both streams of the political divide in the country. The far right, of course, has been very much outspoken. The far left, within the center left, very much outspoken. But what complicates matters for the country, Nhlanhla, is that some of these countries participate in government. They are not articulating their views within the framework of government. They have their own retreat to go and speak on behalf of parties, and yet they are in government. So that's where the contradiction is. So what should happen under normal circumstances is that foreign policy must be articulated by government, particularly parties that are involved in government, even though they have disagreement They may have disagreement. It does not necessarily mean that because they are disagreement, you won't have policy articulation. So they should be able to respect the collective wisdom. And collective wisdom does not mean unanimous agreement. It means they agree to do certain things and they disagree. That even though they may not be in the same wavelength on this issue, but this is the position of the country, and protect the integrity of the country. The country is very much vulnerable as we're talking, because the impression is given that everyone can speak on policy, including within the ruling party, within the ANC, the majority party. You find a lot of people who are talking on foreign policy issues. Some of the issues and the language is not better nuanced. There's contradiction with what government is saying, what political parties are saying. I think it's uncharted territory that ought to be managed very carefully, because the international space, it's a dog-eats-dog situation, Nhlanhla.
Yeah. As mentioned in my intro, the U.S. seized at least one Russian-flagged oil tanker, which is linked to Venezuelan exports into the North Atlantic after this long pursuit that we are gathering, claiming sanctions violations as well. Russia and others have called this piracy and a breach of maritime law. So how do these actions then stack up under international legal norms?
You know, Nhlanhla, the seizure of Bella 1, it's a classical case of unilateral US policy, which is not international policy. The sanctions that everyone is talking about are unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States. They are not international law. And that's why these countries are disregarding them. But I can assure you, Nhlanhla, that a country like China, the United States would not keep on enforcing this blockade of oil to China, because China has greater leverage over the United States. Take it now, Nhlanhla. The United States, China produces, I think, about 4.5 million barrels of oil per day, but they consume 15.5 million barrels of oil per day, which is, and Venezuela supplies them with close to 4 to 6%. But they have other sources of the oil. But the Chinese are not going to sit on their laurels. They're going to come up with retaliatory measures, which would definitely help the United States, because the US now is saying it wants to control the sale of oil from Venezuela. And if they were to block China, the Chinese will retaliate and it will harm the US. The Chinese have determined, particularly the rare earths, they've determined what hurts the United States most, and it's the rare earths. And they're going to use that to maximize compromise from the US. And I can tell you, oil from Venezuela would flow to China.
Yeah. So critics here in South Africa, including former envoys, have said that the US operation undermines international law and sovereignty. So others point to alleged crimes by Maduro's own government. How do we then balance concerns, Mr. Makhubela, about accountability with the need to respect sovereign equality?
Remember, the sovereignty, the definition of sovereignty is that there's no higher authority than a sovereign state. So you account to your own constituents. For instance, South Africa would account to the people. South African government would account to South African people. South African government cannot account to another government. That's where the misnomer is in terms of this. But it doesn't mean that if there are wrong things that are happening within Venezuela, a foreign government has the final authority to impose its will on that government. That's where the huge challenge. And that's what a lot of people are condemning. I mean, I listened to the argument of the Chilean permanent representative at the United Nations. She made it quite clear that they don't recognize the Maduro government. But she went on to say they don't agree with what the United States has done. It's illegal in terms of international law. They don't condone that. They're basically condemning the means that were used to achieve the ends. So that's where the issue is. So we must distinguish between the two as we move forward.
Yeah, which extends quite nicely into my next point. I mean, what precedent does this then set, especially for smaller states in Africa? I mean, we've seen the US acting militarily in Nigeria, for instance. But also, what does this then do in Latin America if powerful countries can use military force or seize vessels without Security Council authorization?
The question that all of us are asking ourselves is, are the actions in Venezuela the end of the international law-based system? Is it the end of multilateralism? Because the United States has undermined international law in a big way. Now, does it mean that individual countries would have the right to do whatever they want to do? Since the Second World War, we've been protected by international law rules. Even though they've been inefficient, there have been challenges, but they really maintain some level of order throughout. So with this behavior of the US, are we likely to see total collapse of the international law? A lot of people are questioning this, and I'm amongst those who are questioning, is the United Nations still relevant? Is it still performing its function? Is the Security Council still a custodian of international peace and security? And though people are talking about reform of these institutions, but as they are constituted now, are they still relevant? Are they still fit for purpose? And the jury's out. I think in the next few months or few years, it will become clear what really these institutions are still relevant. What is quite clear, Nhlanhla, you know, Donald Trump has been speaking about different groups. The group of 2 between him and China, the group of 20, it's collapsing, quite honestly. What is emerging now, it's a group of 1. However oxymorons this may appear to be, the United States, it's a group on its own. It's going to be talking to itself. It has antagonized its own allies. So we would see this amount of contradiction, what it will do, given the fact that the US has enormous power, both economic and militarily, and how it will keep on destabilizing the new multipolar world, or will it become part of it? It would be good if the US was to play a constructive role within the emerging multipolarity, but it would be unfortunate if the US is to be outside and play a negative role from outside.
Right. And then South Africa's stance might affect its diplomatic relationship with the United States. At least that's what some are arguing, from cooperation on peacekeeping to trade and investment. How should we then, or rather, how should Pretoria then navigate these tensions?
Pretoria has to navigate this very carefully. I've been saying this for quite some time, that there's a feud between Europeans and Americans. And Pretoria seems to take the European side, which is unfortunate. You may have seen now that the United States doesn't even care about allies. If the US is contemplating to forcefully take Greenland, it tells you how the alliance is fragmented. So a country that is in the periphery like South Africa has no leverage to influence what the US it can do. The only thing that South Africa can do is to define its destiny and hedge its interests amongst newly emerging powers. And that's how South Africa is going to survive. But there's no way that South Africa can survive on its own without working with other like-minded countries around the world.
Yeah. Dr. Makhubela, finally, at the UN, what should South Africa then realistically be advocating for, especially in order to show up international law, and especially when peace and security are increasingly shaped by a unilateral power like what we're seeing?
Well, individual countries, even collective countries within the United Nations system, have little power and little leverage. The big power now within the UN system rests with the P5, where major decisions are made, and rightfully so, because the Security Council is a custodian of international peace and security. But the paralysis that exists within the Security Council, it's unlikely to provide any clear direction or assurance for smaller countries moving forward. That's why you're going to keep on seeing countries aligning themselves with permanent members of the Security Council in the hope that their interests will be protected. So you won't find a cohesive approach within the Security Council that would address some of these challenges that we're seeing around the world.
Dr. Makhubela, let me thank you for your time. That's a former diplomat and international relations expert, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, giving us his sense of recent developments. Of course, the latest update being that the US has seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic.